although we have many saints who gave their lives for faith, as you will see through this lecture, but I chose these 5 saint martyrs, holy martyrs of our Serbian Orthodox Church, for being representative in some way for what they did through their life and how their end of life was. And this can be also something that we can start from that point on thinking how we can follow their lives in something that we can do in our lives. So to be ready to stay firm in our faith as much as we can and try to compare these efforts and the way how they lived their lives in total before they had their martyrdom. Sorry for moments, we still have some people coming to this session, so don't mind me if I sometimes stop just to admit some people to enter this session. Hello, everybody who joined us recently.
Hello.
Okay, here are those 5 which I will be talking about tonight. It's Saint Avvakum, the deacon, Saint Bosiljka of Pasjane, which means that's a village where she was born and raised, Saint Vukašin of Klepci, and 2 bishops of our church, Saint Bishop Platon of Banja Luka, where I also was born, and Saint Bishop and even Metropolitan Peter of Dobro Bosnia. That's the old medieval name of the diocese in central Bosnia, with the residence in Sarajevo, now the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Each one of these 5 have something in common and something specific. The first 2, which will be represented, Deacon Avvakum and Bosiljka Pasjane, were very young. They passed away at a very young age. Like they both had less than 20 years or maximum 20 years old. And they were forced to accept Islamic beliefs, but they refused. They didn't want to convert, although they were forced, and they were begged by their relatives and friends, but they didn't accept it. Unlike to them, the other 3 represented here tonight, Saint Vukašin, Saint Bishop Platon, and Metropolitan Peter, were in an advanced age. Let's say Vukašin might be in the mid-age of about 50 years old, while Bishop Platon and Metropolitan Peter were in a really advanced age, about 65 to 70 years old. But they also refused to accept conversion, or to they just were murdered for being what they were. They just even were not put into the position to choose between the faith or to convert, but even more, they just were murdered for being Serbian Orthodox Christians at first, and the latter 2 bishops and bishop and metropolitan, they were murdered for being hierarchs, which did not accept to leave their flock, which they were asked to do. So now I will start from this. As you see, this is a general troparion to all martyrs in the Tom Fort, which celebrates many personal deeds of the saints. That's why in most of them they're chosen to be in tone 4. It's something specific. I hope we'll talk about liturgy and church music in some on future lectures, maybe, so that I can explain about the meaning of these tones and so on. But here, what they are glorified for is for staying firm and steadfast, even before the threatening of life, just in order not to abandon their faith and not to accept any kind of leaving their Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Okay, Saint Deacon Avvakum, I'm not sure how familiar you are with him, about his life. He might be less known here in United States. Now, out abroad of our old countries. But there is very celebrated and honored in our church, especially in the place where he was born, raised, and where he was executed in being 20 years old. So according to what history had found about his life, he was born in 1794 or around that year in nowadays northern Bosnia, around the Kozara mountain. It's very little known about the early time of his life. What is known is that being about 13 or 14 years old, he went to monastery nearby his hometown. It was monastery Moštanica on the mountain Kozara, and he wanted to stay there to become monk. And he accepted his monastic vows at about age of 15, which is very young age for today's perception, because now for becoming a monk, it's usually prescribed to the person to be over 21 years old. But at that time, we can assume that people either were getting matured earlier due to the time and due to the harsh living conditions and everything else, or that it was just some kind of church economy at a time where there were very few of clergymen anywhere due to the persecution of the clergymen and all Christians. So even those individuals who would express they're willing to become monks or clergymen would be accepted even younger than 18 years old to become that. So as early as of being 15 years old and becoming a monk, he already was forced to move from his monastery of his consecration, and along with another persons from a monastery, several monks, and the abbot Gennady, who also had his son there with them, with the monks. His son was not a monk, he was just living there and was educated, because as you might know, during the Turkish time, many people went to monastery to be educated, literated, to learn how to write and read and so on. So,
excuse me, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. I just got a note from Marlene. She'd like to join, but you need to allow her to join.
Oh yes, excuse me. I will just go there and do that.
Sorry about that.
Give me a second. Oh yes, you're waiting. Okay. Okay, I think now. Okay, now we have 9 participants, right? If I see well. Okay,
Hi.
I'm getting back. Due to the first Serbian uprisal in the early 19th century, under the Karađorđe Petrović, there were very turbulent time, and Turks became even more cruel to the Serbian population, the Orthodox population in general, and moreover to clergymen. And Abbot ordered moving from there to the territory of Serbia, so meaning from northern Bosnia to central Serbia. And they moved to the area of Čačak, city of Čačak. It's like, let's say, central western part of nowadays Serbia. And they settled in monastery Trnova. I mentioned that was Abbot Gennady from Moštanica with his son and with other monks. And along with them, there was Deacon Avakum, who already became a deacon at the age of 17. And they stayed there for a few years before something even harsher started. There they met the other brotherhood of the monastery of Trnava with their abbot Avakum. And what happened is that after a few years, after the end of the first Serbian uprisal, there were several other smaller uprisals. One of them was so famous uprisal of Hadži Prodan in 1814. At that time, that uprisal was not so huge as it was the previous one, but Turks again terminated it and started persecution and punishment of all those prominent leaders of that reprisal, and they brought them, although they gave, let's say, a word, but it went out as many times before, the same. The Turks, when they say something, they just do not fulfill their promising, and they promised not to execute anybody of those leaders, but they eventually captured 300. Oh, sorry. Some comment or question? Sorry for I cannot hear sometimes. Okay. And at that moment, they just brought all those persons to execute them in Belgrade, and that's what happened to Deacon Avakum and many other people. They were brought before the tower of Belgrade, which is now so-called Kalemegdan. In past, there was a famous gate at the entrance of the city of Belgrade in Turkish time, and it was called Stamboul Gate. And it was famous or infamous by as being an execution place. And they brought many people there, and they did a very cruel method of execution by stabbing them onto the stack, wooden stack, causing and provoking very slow dying. It was really a torture and martyrdom for all these people. Among them was a bot Avakum. He didn't accept to convert to Islam, but the other abbot who came from Bosnia, Abbot Gennady, accepted, unfortunately, and he became a Muslim. And seeing that, Deacon Avakum was very firm and very decisive in not to abandon his faith, not to convert, not to do anything like that. He even started singing, glorifying our God and glorifying his faith, not accepting anything. Among those who were mourning him already during the procession of the execution was his mother, who tried also to convince him to convert, trying to save his life, but he also rejected his mother's words by his own words of like, "Thank you, my dear mother, for the milk, for rising me up, but not. I cannot thank you for your words to convert." And seeing how firm he is in his faith, the leader of the Turks and the commander of the city of Belgrade and of the Belgrade Pashaluk, the territory, the county, it was so famous Suleiman Pasha Skopljak. He ordered his Turkish soldiers not to execute him in cruel way, but just to do that in a less cruel way, although it's still very cruel, to be beheaded, which was, let's say, at that time, more common than the way of execution through the stabbing on the wooden stick.
Excuse me, Miroslav, it's me again. Can you let some more people in?
Oh, yes, sure. Now I see the waiting room. This is better. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome. You're welcome, Elena.
We had kind of secretly planned a family.
Oh, I hear some.
I think you can mute people that are not.
Oh, yeah, if somebody want to ask something, you're welcome to interrupt me at any time if you want to ask, or we can wait until the end of the lecture and then ask whatever you like. I'm fine with both. I just try to get informed about these facts and something that is important also for our lives. Okay, I'll go on and then next. It's a bit slow. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is the next slide. Now I will tell a few words about Saint Bosilka from Pasiene. Or her full name was Bosilka Rajčić. It's also very little known about her life. She was born and raised in what is now eastern part of Kosovo and Metohija territory, which is, as you know, under dispute. Although being part of Serbia, now it's occupied by Albanian forces there, as you know, and it's claimed independence and so on. And she was born in part which is also very much populated by Serbian people, Serbian Orthodox Christians, although there were some other villages populated by Albanians nearby. As you can see, this is the place where she was born. It's close to Gnjilane and Preševo. This map. It was the mid-19th century. All along this time, so which you can see Serbia gained their independence after those uprisals at the beginning of 19th century, but many territories like Kosovo and Sanjak and Bosnia and Herzegovina, all settled by Serbs, Orthodox Christians, they were still under the Ottoman Turkish rulership until the beginning of 20th century. And there were many outlaws and outlaw situations during that time, such as this, what happened in Bosiljka's life. During some event, some occasion, in her village, an Albanian Muslim, which was at that time called Arnaut, as we know, those Albanians at Kosovo and Albania, they were called by Ottoman Turks as Arnauts, which has similar meaning. And one of those Arnauts, one of those Albanians, in fact, tried to approach her, although she was very young at that time. She was about 17 years old. But seeing that she does not want even to see him and not even more to accept to marry him, that guy decided to capture her. He did a kidnapping. So she was kidnapped and moved to the village of that Albanian and put in kind of house prison. And he tried to convince her to convert to Islam, then to marry him, which she constantly refused. She was very aware of what it means, that eventually there is no other way either to convert or to be executed. But she stood firm till her last moments. Then, seeing that there is no way to convince her to convert, that guy murdered her near the river of Lapušnica. But he was very cruel again, as similar to what happened to Deacon Avakum, who was also sentenced to very cruel death. This young girl was also murdered, and then her body was mutilated, either by one or by many of these guys. It's now not sure what happened there, but definitely it was for sure that she did not want to accept conversion. There were also several older ladies of Serbian origin who converted to Islam, who came to the house of that Albanian trying to convince that girl, but she again didn't want. So we see being very steady and firm in those old time, let's say like 200, 300 years ago, people knew more what their faith mean. And it was not just like a kind of materialism or some other aspects of our life for what we find kind of excuses and saying, okay, I can do more if I stay longer in my life, I can do something more valuable for the other people, for this or for that. It is very questionable in that point whether we are acting really properly, because we never know when our time for dying is and when we are ready for something and when we can get ready, even though we are never ready to be what we are asked to be, to become, as we know, a gods by blessing, by God's blessing and by the economy of God, so that we can become God's sons, as it is his only son, Jesus Christ. But at that point, we are starting most often to calculate. Those calculations, we in fact are endangered to lose our faith, to be like with a weakened faith. And that's something that just I would like to say through all these specific examples of these people, that what can provoke, what can cause such young people like these two young people who became saints to act in that way. Whether it is just being raised and educated like home educated by their parents in that way to stay firm. Or we can see that many of those people at the time were also staying firm, as we know that the Serbian population didn't fully converted, like not everybody converted to Islam, although many of them were forced and tortured and pressured and everything else. But as we know, as a fact, people stayed in their faith. So we can see that our faith can be kept even in a more harsh condition than it was and than it is in our lives nowadays. And as we know, the history repeats again and again. The church where the relics of Basilica were placed and entombed, that church was soon afterwards was destroyed by similar Arnauts, Albanians, maybe sons of those who tortured and murdered Saint Basilica. It was destroyed and put on fire, then destroyed. Then it was for several times rebuilt and again destroyed. And eventually, for the last time, it was rebuilt at the beginning of 2000s, about 2001, 2002. And it survived by nowadays. Hopefully it will stay for longer. And you can see her relics placed and entombed there. Her relics were put in the foundations of church, which is a manner for holy martyrs, for saints, for their relics and their bodies to be placed during the sanctification of the church, the consecration of the church, in fact, that objects, buildings like a church, and especially the holy table where there is a service of the divine liturgy and the other service, should contain the relics of saints. And that's why we see that Basilica was recognized as a saint in among the community of Serbian Orthodox Christians there long before she was canonized by the church. So this is a good point for you to know that becoming a saint is not just a matter of some kind of decision of some hierarchs, of some, let's say, government or whatever, church government, as we can imagine in the wrong way. But it is kind of reception and recognition by the community of faithful people of one region where that saint has had his or her life and had something of his deeds and is connected for some territory, or just where his or her relics, body relics, were placed and so on. So it started like that. People recognize and start venerating, and through the time, through the decades, as the hierarchs of church recognize that people have such, let's say, attitude toward the saint, the person who is about to become saint, then church just is doing a kind of act of recognition, the de facto state, which is already in the church. So becoming a saint is not a matter of the decision, not a matter of kind of enforcement or something like that, of prescription or whatever. It is recognition by the local community, the first. Now we go about maybe 70, 80 years later. Now it's mid of 20th century. As we know, from 1939 till 1945, there was a Second World War. And at that time, as most of you might know, there were horrible persecutions of Serbian Orthodox Christians, Serbian people, at the territory of independent state of Croatia, which was a puppet state made by Hitler Nazi Germany, supported by them. And they were put in law that Serbs were put out of law, in fact, so that they were ordered either to get out of the state, like to leave the country of the independent state of Croatia, or to convert, or otherwise to be murdered. And it was very much literally applied in that early period of that state, starting on 1941. There was an order from the Poglavnik, from the head of state, infamous Ante Pavelic, that all Serbs born out of independent state of Croatia territory, which means like in the territory of Montenegro or central Serbia or wherever, they are about to leave the territory of independent state of Croatia in like 72 hours, starting on the date, I don't know, May 3rd or May 5th of 1941. And many people did as it was ordered, but it was not the case of some of hierarchs. So it was the case, oh, sorry, I need to bring something. Sorry for the quick interruption. I needed just to plug in my computer. Many hierarchs, many priests, bishops, and other clergymen were executed for not leaving the country and being at the origin of out of the state of Croatia, as you know. But it happened even to the people who were born at the territories of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, which were the part of that state. And it was the case with this person, Saint Vukašin of Klepci. In fact, he was born and raised in the village of Klepci. It was a southwestern Herzegovina. His full name and baptism was Vukašin Mandrapa. His last name was Mandrapa. There is a family name in that part of Herzegovina. It's very known. And it's also very little known about his life. He was a common peasant living in his village for long time. And then later in his life, just years before ongoing of the World War II, he went to work like as a seasonal worker in the city of Sarajevo, where he was eventually captured around 1942. He was brought to Jasenovac concentration camp, very infamous Jasenovac, as you know from Serbian history. It's a place where more than 300,000 people are murdered for sure, and there is speculation it might be even more than 500,000 people murdered there. Yeah, as I can point out here that his village was destroyed during his lifetime at the Second World War, but even more, it was destroyed again in the last wartime in the 90s, when Croatian military forces destroyed all those Serbian houses there, which were the major population in that village. So again, history is repeating again and again. And he was brought with many other people in Jasenovac concentration camp, and he was murdered very quickly. He was not put there to stay for some time, but as many people in Jasenovac, he was also murdered immediately upon arrival there. He was brought to the part where there was executions across the Sava River, across the territory of the camp itself. It was so infamous Gradina place, and he was murdered overnight, again in a very infamous event. At the time, several of Ustasha soldiers, as you know, Ustasha is the name for those Croatian paramilitary forces, kind of imitation of SS German Nazi forces, which were extremely cruel in their military operation. Those didn't even go to any military operation. They were just very cruel to the civilian population who were brought to those camps. In fact, instead of working as forced laborers, they were, in fact, was executed immediately upon arrival. And one night in September 1943, several of those Ustasha soldiers decided to make a tournament, kind of totally weird tournament, who can murder more people in one night. And there was a convoy of about between 3,000 to 5,000 people, which were surrounded by Ustasha forces. And there were about 7, 8 Ustashas who started that tournament. And one of them, whose name is also known, but now, as we can say here, it's in God's memory, those who commit such horrible crimes, who do such horrible deeds in general, are just erased from the names of saints. So that's why I wouldn't even mention these executors there. But there were several of them who were prosecuted after the World War II and were sentenced to death. And that was their testimony about this event itself and about the actors who were in that tournament and everything else. And this guy who committed that crime, who murdered all those guys, among them Saint Vukashin, he later got mad, got hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic, and he gave his testimony to the medical doctor who made a record. And that's also the other source of what happened there in detail, specifically about Saint Vukashin. That's the only part of his life which was known. And that record goes that Saint Vukashin was standing among those people who were about to be slaughtered. And Ustasha guy came to him and ordered him to put on his knees in order to slaughter him. As you know, Ustashas were doing their murdering the people by knives in cold blood. And that was the same here. But at that moment, he saw this, he just noticed that one guy is standing and just gazing at him, not saying anything, very peaceful, very quietly. And it made him very nervous. The Ustasha gets so nervous about that there is one guy who does not afraid of that, what's going on around him. He came, and that's why he ordered him, go to your knees, and Vukashin just put down, and he didn't even do any kind of refusal, anything like that. And then he was ordered to say many years to Poglavnik, to Ante Pavelic, but he was silent. He didn't say anything. Then many years to state of Croatia, he didn't accept this, nothing. He just was silent. Eventually, this Ustasha guy became so outrageous, he started torturing him, he started stabbing him, and eventually he mutilated him and murdered him and everything else. So this is represented on this icon. It's the way how, one of those ways how Saint Vukashin is represented. One more time, I want to point out here that he is just one among many of the martyrs of Jasenovac who were canonized by our church. So, because almost all of those Serbian villagers, peasants who came there, who were brought to the concentration camp of Jasenovac, were brought there to be murdered just for being Serbian Orthodox Christians. They were innocent, they were not even known. They were vast majority of them didn't have any kind of record in police, anything like that, no way to be sentenced for anything, but they were murdered, and in cold blood, in a very horrible way. And that's again why our Holy Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, is acting in a way how it's a very long tradition in Orthodox Church in general, that those people who were murdered just for being Christians are immediately recognized as saints. The other thing is, if they were put on the choice whether to convert, to leave their Christianity or not, as it was the case in the previous two persons who I represent to you, the other two saints. But this is that nobody even asks someone whether he wanted or not to accept the other faith, the other religion. He was just murdered for being what he is. It's a very specific stance. And as you can see, for our life, it's not even important who you were in your life, how big, how prominent, how important you were, how rich you were, how whatever educated you were. No, nothing else is known about Vukashin, and nothing else is important before God for any one of us. but what we really do for our eternal life in God. That's something that we must keep in mind, because as this world is just, and time is going on and on, it's more and more temptation from this, let's say, conformism and materialism and everything else, which just dives us and brought us down into the water of this, let's say, unconscious life of being out of the real faith and real staying in church. So this is why I want to point out, and not trying to compare, because it is really given to very rare of us who can stand such a horrible and such a difficult way of dying and being like murdered and tortured and so on. Martyrdom is the blessing of God. We must admit that. But on the other side, we must see that all of these lives, all of these examples are also applicable to some extent in our lives. And eventually, I will represent these two bishops of our Serbian Orthodox Church. I decided to put them together because also their lives and their examples are very similar one to another. They were of a similar age. Saint Bishop Platon of Banja Luka was born about 1874, while Bishop Peter is about 1866. What is known about their life, it's much more known than comparing to the other three saints. Bishop Platon was born in southern Serbia and was educated in Russian theological seminaries. Later on, for many years, he was abbot of several monasteries. He was also active in publishing the Serbian church publications, newspapers, and so on. He was in the printing service of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and he was very, let's say, robust, and his temper was very, like, say, flammable, and so he was not like a kind of very peaceful and silent monk. He was a monk, but he was like a kind of zealous personality, and he was doing all the things in his life very passionately, in a way. Unlike to him, the other bishop, Metropolitan Peter, was son of a very prominent family. He was son of Count Bogdan Zimonjić, a very famous leader of Herzegovina Serbs, and one of those who started the famous uprisal in Herzegovina in 1875 against Turks, which brought Austria-Hungary into the territory of Bosnia, which occupied the territory at that time. And during the Austria-Hungary occupation of Bosnia, he was elected a bishop, as very educated, again, also in Russia, as many bishops at that time. And his service started in 903, first as a bishop of Herzegovina, then later he became a metropolitan of whole Bosnia and Herzegovina. And let's say, unless there was their martyrdom at the end of their lives, they probably would not be remembered so much along their lives. There were many interesting things and important things they did, but what made them such important and remembered forever, not only in the eternal memory of God, but also in the eternal memory of the church on earth, is how they decided to pass away from this life. And both did nearly the same. As I mentioned, the head of the state of Croatia at that time, Ante Pavelić, issued an order for all those Serbs born out of independent state of Croatia to leave that territory. And it was referred to Bishop Platon, who was born in Leskovac, Serbia. And that order was given to him by the head of Banja Luka county, where he was resided, and his seat was there. So an agent from that guy, from the head of Banja Luka, delivered a message to Platon to leave. But then Bishop Platon wrote a very famous letter to that guy, stating that he cannot leave his flock. He is, as a bishop, he is leader of all devoted, faithful people, as a member of church, and he cannot just make this church be headed by living as hierarch, as head of that church. He must stay there and share the fate of the other people. Whatever happened to them will happen to him. And those words were really, let's say, following the words and deeds of the holy apostles, the disciples of Christ, the same way they did. They followed, and they, since they bring the Christianity to many of the other nations and people all around the territories of the world which were known at that time, but they did not accept to leave those communities, early Christian communities. The same was with Platon. He said, I cannot do that. And just 2 days later, in the night between 4th and 5th of May of 1941, he was put in a car along with 2 Croatian soldiers, brought out of the city and executed, also by torturing before he was murdered. And like 2 or 3 weeks later, his body was found in the river nearby the city. Then he was secretly entombed, and later, after the World War, and many decades later, since there was a communism and it was forbidden to be celebrated and so on, but later in the early 90s, he was recognized, and it was proposed that he be added to the list of saints of Serbian Church, and it eventually happened in 1999. Both of these holy fathers were put in the list of the saints. Bishop Peter was arrested a few days after Bishop Platon, although he was a native of that state of Croatia, or in fact a native of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as part of that state of Croatia. But he was also imprisoned in Sarajevo just for being Serbian Orthodox hierarch. And a few weeks later, he was transported to another concentration camp of Jadovno in the southern part of Croatia. It was very littoral part, rocky parts, mountains, and so on. There were many caves there, natural caves in the concrete, in the vapor, you know. And what happened is that he shared the fate of many other Serbian Orthodox people. Serbian Orthodox priests were brought there and was murdered. It's not even known which exact day, but later on, he also was given a specific feast day in the year in the church calendar for celebrating his holy person. Something that I want to point as specific here to point out about Bishop Platon or any other saints is that we often think that one person being a saint is expected to be perfect in everything all over his life. But it's not the case. As we remember, the first example of the sainthood, which was given to the robber on the cross next to the Christ's cross, on the right-hand side from our Lord Jesus Christ, there was a robber, theft and whatever, outlaw, but who repented for his deeds at the end and asked the name of God and asked and recognized Jesus Christ as God and Lord, and was granted the kingdom of heaven, as we know. So the same way, there was a word in New Testament in the Gospel of Luke, where I can just say, not literally reading here, but maybe that's a kind of paraphrasing, citing of that, is that in what I found you, I will judge you by that. That's what Christ say to his disciples. And that's something which is here the same. we can have our ups and downs throughout our life, but eventually our attitude toward the end of our life gives some kind of crown which finalize and shape whole our life. And it was the same in this case. Like Bishop Platon was famous by his robust character and very passionate, sometimes in his reaction. Once he was posted as a bishop of Ohrid, where before him there was a bishop, Nikolai Velimirovich, which I talked about previously, as you know. And it was famous that he was in a conflict with Bishop Nikolai. They were very conflicted about the administrational matters, since, as you know, Bishop Nikolai was very scientific and the personality of like a writer and a preacher and so on, but he was not so skillful as Platon was in the church administration at sometimes, occasionally. So when Platon came there after him in 1938, he found those economy books, like things about the economy of the monasteries, of the church, in a mess. And he got outraged, and he criticized openly Bishop Nikolai, and he started even a polemics and argument over the newspapers, church newspapers. Then it went into the common newspapers, and it started like it went into something that we can say was not so good at the end of the day. But as we can see, both of these holy fathers gained their sainthood by their lives in total. Moreover, Bishop Platon was infamous by the fact that criticizing Bishop Nikolai was not so accepted by faithful people in many of the dioceses of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Many people in Serbian Orthodox Church already knew at that time the greatness of Bishop Nikolai and his importance, and his sainthood was recognized even during his life. But it was unlike to Bishop Platon, who was very much, let's say, the reception of him was very much negative among the church circles and so on. And people in the Diocese of Banja Luka, northern Bosnia, they didn't want even to accept him as elected bishop. And they did obstructions anyway, through some intrigues, through some political, like, lobbies and whatever. So they prevented his arrival to Banja Luka for more than a year, almost 2 years. And eventually he came overnight without even enthronement, which is mandatory for becoming a bishop. But he came there, took his duties and started being a bishop. It was a really, let's say, not a good habit at that time. And it was just 6 months before his martyrdom. But eventually, he confessed his faith in the uttermost way. And he gave his life for his faith and for his people. And that's, again, something that is referred to the Holy Testament, to the New Testament, to the, I think it's the Gospel of Mark, where our Lord Jesus Christ said, there is no greater love than this, when you give your life for those who are friends of you, who, how to translate, who is a bližnji, as it's said in the Slavonic translation. It's like for your neighbors, for anybody who is your brother or sister in Christ. So if you give your life for someone else, that's something that's greater than anything else for our Christian life. And that's the case what Bishop Platon did. And holy relics of these holy fathers are entombed. Bishop Platon's relics are in Banja Luka Cathedral Church. Bishop Peter's are in a old church, old Serbian church in Sarajevo. It's Saint Tekla Church. So I think it's quite enough. Yeah, it's 9:05. now I would stop and let you ask whatever you want and comment and anything else. And thank you for your attention.
This is Melina. I have a question. What miracles are associated with any of these saints that you've talked about tonight?
Well, about miracles, yeah, that's an important aspect. So not all of the saints are expected to have some miracles so that you recognize them as a saint. That's also important point. I cannot say for sure that there were, or also I cannot say for sure that there were not miracles from all those saints which I represented tonight. But that's important point to say that it's not something mandatory for someone to be recognized as a saint, to be a miracle worker, a wonder worker, as you say. I guess there are some testimonies, at least for some of them. But what is more important is the way how someone who is extremely prominent, for instance, like bishops, and even more who is not so prominent in his...
What did you express?
At some point express his faith
A lot out.
extreme way. And that was the case with all five.
So now we're back to like a 1 a.m. expression.
We can also say, how can we expect, or what kind of expectation we can have about...
Okay, well, let me
all
fucking
martyrs
change
of
the
the
Amazon
saints.
order.
So all those people of Serbian Orthodox faith who were murdered in Jasenovac's camp, whether it is 100,000,
$50.
500,000, we do not know exactly, but we recognize them as saints. Our Serbian Orthodox Church recognizes them, and that's accepted by all the other Orthodox Christian churches. So that's what I would like to point out about this question. I think there is also some hearing. I'm not sure where it comes from.
I can tell you, whoever's B are not on mute. They need to be on mute. You can mute them, Miroslav.
Well, yeah, I can. Well,
Probably
I'm
a good
sure where
idea.
it comes from. There is some like a cat meowing, but I'm not sure. Is it yours, Yelena, or no?
No.
No. I just hear somebody. I don't know where it comes from. Oh, maybe it's Ron. Ron, are you there? Oh, Ron is not here. I haven't seen Ron coming into the session, and maybe he just left. Although his invitation to join stayed, so I accepted him. Maybe that's why I hear some other side voices. So please, any other question, comment? I would like not this to be just my boring lecture, but to be more like a discussion and thinking. What I would like to point out here, okay, you see how these holy fathers and holy people gave their lives. That's something most precious in our life, which is our life, in fact. And what we are ready to do, and how can we be similar to them in our lives, in whatever aspect, how can we keep our faith firm? As you might see now, we are also under some kind of temptation of whether to go to church or not due to the ordering of the state and so on. This is also interesting point. Are we just to be like staying? Let's suppose if there is something that we cannot come to church forever, what would we be doing in that in that instance? Like whether to stay like that or try to make our going to church possible or whatever and so on, or to be ready to lose our head, even lose our life for not obeying some orders and disobeying it or whatever. So that's important question that we must think every day in our life, to be aware where are the limits, the borderlines of our being Christian, of our confession of our faith. So yeah, please let me know whatever opinions and thinking you have. No, there is no question, nothing. Anyway, we are living in a, let's say, way more easier way of life. And what's our sacrifice that we can sustain for our faith, for our church? That's also a good question that we should think of. It's very easy just to be sitting in our room and thinking about holy fathers, saints, and so on. At the other side, we cannot contribute to that. Or, okay, we are going to church as something that we are expected. If we are a Christian, that's kind of minimum that we must do, and it's part of our life, just to be part of the whole divine liturgies. But we should be thinking of how we can do more and more, how we can get into, let's say, spiritual improvement, spiritual climbing and whatever. And it's also interesting that this kind of martyrdom and in fact like being executed for faith was named in the early church, Christian church, as baptizing in blood, or baptism in blood. For those who were not Christians at the moment of their execution, but they confessed the Holy Trinity, the Triunited God, Jesus Christ and his name, and then being executed, they would be recognized as Christians just by that act. And although they were not received the baptism in a normal way through the sanctified water and immersion and so on, they were recognized as baptized by their own blood. That's extreme moments which we should be aware of. Also, like in cases when priests are captured before the execution, it was several times during the persecution of the Christians in 3rd and 4th century that they were put in a fire and they were not able even to sit or stand. And some of them were clergymen. They wanted to serve divine liturgy in prison, and they were just forced to be laying down on their back. What they would do, they would get some pieces of bread, put on their chest, and they were doing the divine liturgy, the transfiguration of the bread into the holy blood and body of our Lord Jesus Christ. Even not having wine, they would use just bread, at that moment being for both wine and bread. So that's kind of extreme aspects how our faith can be lived and can be expressed, and this is also accepted. And after that, that priest, for instance, would be giving the body of Christ to everybody, doing the communion, the Holy Communion, in a very unexpected way. So this is what I just want to point out at this moment. Please let me know if you have any other question, any comment, anything like that.